In this question, we're given a graph that represents last year's cost of a banquet based on the number of students attending. We're also told that this year the cost per person is going to be decreased by $5 and that the initial fee will be doubled. What we have to figure out then is the cost equation for this year, and we have to describe two ways in which the graphs will differ from each other. Okay, well, the first thing we notice is the graph is linear, and it involves a rate, which is a cost per person, and it also involves an initial fee. So let's set up a table here that looks at last year versus this year and compares the cost per person, which is our rate, and the initial fee. So let's start with last year. We look at the last year cost line here. The initial fee will be right here where it crosses the c-axis. So let's look at this point right there. So we can tell from the c vertical axis here that that's going to be $600 for the initial cost. And we know that because each one of these markings here would be 200, 400, 600, 800, etc. So our initial fee here would be $600. Now let's look at the cost per person. Well, that represents the rate, or in other words, the slope of this line. So to find slope, we need a couple of points on the line. We already have one, which is our initial fee here. So let's go across, let's say to 200 students, go up to our line and see what that point is, and then we can determine the slope. Now you could have picked any 2 points on the line, but these ones seem to make sense. So our slope or rate or whatever you want to call it would be the change in cost divided by the change in the number of students. So let's look at the change in cost. Well, the initial cost is $600, and if we go all the way up to here, the cost at 200 students would be $3,800, it looks like. So the change would be $3,800 minus $600, and the change in the number of students would be from 0 all the way up to 200. So 3,800 minus 600 would be 3,200 divided by 200. And what we can do is we can cancel out the zeros there. 2 goes into itself once, 2 goes into 32 16 times. So therefore, the cost per person from last year was $16. Now let's look at this year. Well, they tell us that this year the cost per person has decreased by $5. Well, that means that the cost per person for this year, if it's decreased by $5, would be $11 per person. They also tell us that the initial fee has doubled. Well, if last year's initial fee was $600, this year's initial fee would be $1,200. We have enough information now to figure out our cost equations actually for both years. So for the cost for last year, it would equal the rate of change, which is $16 per person, 16N, plus the initial fee, which is $600. And the cost for this year would equal $11 per person, 11N, plus the initial fee of $1,200. So for the cost equation for this year, then is this right here. So we can write that in. The cost equation will be 11N plus 1,200. To finish off, we have to describe two ways in which this year's and last year's cost lines are different. Well, let's go ahead and graph this year's line. I'm going to erase this part here to make it a little bit easier to see. So we know that the initial value for this year is $1,200, so we can put that point right there on our graph. So let's pick another point. Let's say 200 students. So I put 200 into n here. 11 times 200 would be 2200 plus 1200 would be 3400. So we come over and write the point 3400 at 200 students would be about there. And let's pick one more point just to make sure we got it right. It's a straight line. So let's say it was 100 students here. Well, if we put in 100 for n, that will be 1100 plus 1200, which would give us 2300. So we go up to 2300 at 100 would be about there. And we can draw the line, which looks something like that. So if we look at this line, we can see that it's less steep. In other words, the cost per person is lower. And the other thing is that its c-intercept is higher than last year, and that is because the initial value was doubled. So we can say, for example, here that this year's graph is less steep and that the c-intercept is higher. And there you go.